R.C. Sproul, who went home to be with the Lord recently, wrote often on the subject of God's sovereign providence, and I pulled off one of his books from my shelf at home and read through it, sort of as a silent tribute of my own to this author and professor who loved to write and speak on the subject of the sovereignty of God. He had an interesting wit and humor. In fact, in this publication I read, he retold a humorous story. It actually heard first from a pastor friend of his by the name of James Montgomery Boyce. And it goes like this. Sproul writes, there was a mountain climber who slipped on a ledge and was about to plummet thousands of feet to his death. But as he started to fall, he grabbed the branch of a tiny, scraggly tree that was growing out of a crack in the face of that sheer rocky cliff. And as he clung to the branch, the roots of that little tree began to pull loose. And the climber knew that he was facing certain death. And so in his despair, he cried out to the heavens, is there anybody up there who can help me? Is there anyone at all? And suddenly, to his total surprise, he heard a booming voice from the sky respond, yes, I'm here, and I will help you. Thank you, the mountain climber said. The voice continued, let go of the branch. Trust me. The man looked down in the abyss. He looked up toward heaven, and then he said, is there anybody else up there who can help me? Sproul went on to write that this mentality essentially typifies the mentality of the evangelical community today. We wouldn't mind hearing from God as long as he delivers a message or a plan or a command that we're comfortable with, that we like. But if it involves trust in the face of hardship or suffering, we wonder if we got the message right. In fact, we might even wonder, is there anybody else up there who can help us? The Apostle Peter has been dealing with the reality of trusting God even in the face of difficulty and hardship. He began his subject by challenging us to remain calm, to stay involved as the hostility of culture increased, to keep pressing on, rejoicing in the glory of God. He really doesn't pull any punches for end-time believers. Suffering and hardship and trust and faith all need to be packed in the backpack of end-time believers. But Peter has also provided a truckload of encouragement along the way, and part of it has been in rethinking the subject of suffering. So if you take your copy of the New Testament, let's go back to 1 Peter chapter 4. We're going to pick up his final comments on the subject before he changes his topic in chapter 5. But what I want to do today is point out 4 or 5 observations in rather rapid fashion. Some of it will be a refresher course. Some of it will be nuanced with new emphases from the quill of the Apostle Peter. And the first observation is this: suffering is tailor-made to strengthen your faith, not weaken your faith. Notice verse 19 now, just the first few words, sort of let them sink in. Therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God, and you got to hold it right there. Did I hear that correctly? Those who suffer according to the will of God. I thought that suffering occurred to those out of the will of God. I thought suffering could be alleviated if you return to the will of God. I thought suffering could be alleviated if your faith was strong and your walk was steady. You mean to tell me that you can suffer and that happens to be the will of God for your life? And you're tempted to wonder, is anybody else up there who can help you out? Those who suffer according to the will of God. Here's the perspective Peter has already delivered to us. Suffering, we've learned, is a tutor, assigned by the Spirit of God that rests upon you and enables you not to destroy you, but to develop you. Now here he adds, notice the secret behind it all. You are suffering according to the will of God, which means trials are tailor-made, and the tailor is God. He measures us and our lives, and he suits us up with suffering according to his divine purposes and designs. Let me make another observation. Spiritual maturity can be deepened then through fiery trials. He wrote a few verses earlier on the subject and told us, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing. Chapter 4 and verse 12. Now the idea of testing isn't to see if you flunked out. The idea of testing here comes from the goldsmiths we've learned from Peter's generation, who are in the process of purifying gold, adding more fuel to the fire, increasing the heat in order to remove the impurities until they could see in those ancient days their own reflection in the liquid gold. So in that analogy, which is intended to encourage the believer in Peter's day and our day, the pressure is increasing. Cultural heat is becoming more hostile. In fact, for them in the coming years, just 3 or 4 years, no later than 10 years, statewide open persecution will burst upon the scene against these early believers. And Peter is informing them and us, no matter in whatever way you suffer, God is controlling the heat and the length of time in the crucible so that he can see the reflection of his Son in you. Think of it this way. One author provoked my thinking when he writes, no one earns a diploma or a degree without testing. The curriculum of Christ-likeness is much the same. But the interesting thing about God's schoolroom is that we grade our own tests. Why? Well, he doesn't test us so that he can learn how much we're changing. He tests us so that we can learn how much we're changing. And what are the test results? And in this context, how different are they from the world? How different are our responses to difficulty from the unbelieving who live around us, who also go through hard times? They also lose their money, their children, their fortune, their career, their home, their health, and on and on. How different is our response to evil imposed upon us? Well, just look at the world's response to that one. They will curse God because of it. When times get tough, they will curse him. They will blame him. They'll reject him. They want to use evil to rule out the legitimacy of Christianity, right? By the way, Billy Graham, as you know, I'm sure it's been all over the news, that internationally known evangelist passed away a few days ago. And I might add, I have always admired this man's personal integrity and humility over nearly an 80-year span of ministry and in an incredibly public manner. But he was once asked by a skeptic, if Christianity is valid, if it really is authentic, why is there so much evil in the world? To which he responded, probably with a smile on his face, well, with so much soap available in the world, why are there so many dirty people? Must be applied. And by the way, in this letter, Peter never tells the believer how they can afford evil or avoid evil, how they can avoid things done against them or to them, how they can avoid suffering. The difference between our response is what he's after. Our response in the world around us, because we happen to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. In fact, think of it this way. We happen to rejoice that we belong to a Savior who suffered for a reason. It was no accident. Peter preached in his opening sermon, you put him to death, but it was the preordained plan of God. He was pierced, Isaiah writes, for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Talk about suffering because of evil, and at the same time being in the middle of the will of God the Father. We rejoice because the Spirit of God has applied that suffering and his bloodshed and his death and his atoning work on the cross to our hearts and to our lives. We have been saved because he was willing to suffer evil. Now, I love this next expression in the text. Peter actually gives us a key principle to this entire process of growing through suffering. Notice what he writes, therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls. That word souls refers to everything about your life. Your past, your present, your future. Everything that you hold deeply within you that might bring you suffering. The tears to your eyes, your disappointments, your highs and lows, everything about your life, your questions, your doubts, your fears. Entrust all of it to him. And what I especially love about this expression in the original language is Peter isn't writing about a one-time action here. He's using the present tense to indicate this is a continual, daily entrusting of your souls to your Creator. You could rather woodenly translate this phrase, be constantly entrusting your souls to a faithful Creator. Which means every day, beloved, think of it this way, every day ought to be a rededication of our lives to Jesus Christ. The term Peter uses here, translated entrust, again, such a perfect word. It's a banking term. It means to deposit for safekeeping. To deposit your life to God, your Father, for safekeeping. Let me make some quick observations. This deposit isn't periodical, it's continual. It's day by day, sometimes hour by hour, sometimes minute by minute. Every day, you're going to go down by means of your spirit and your mind to the bank of God's goodness and grace and power and sovereign providence and say to him, I want to make another deposit today. I know I was here yesterday. I know I was here late last night. I know I was here an hour ago, but I'm back. Because I tend to commit my life to you and then I take it back. I tend to entrust it and I think, I got a better idea. See, he's writing to Christians. He isn't talking about salvation. That's a once and for all transaction. He's not talking about redemption. He's talking about progression. And he's writing this to the believer. Next, let me observe this deposit isn't accidental, it's intentional. This is an intentional exercise of trust and faith, no matter what the storm conditions are like around you. Those winds of discouragement come against you, and those billowing waves, as the hymn writer wrote, roll over you. Even when the roots of that little tree you're hanging on to seem to be pulling away from the cliff where you're hanging on for dear life. And the message from God is let go. And you make that intentional decision to deposit who you are into his hands. Let me also point out this deposit isn't partial, it's total. Best way to deposit your life daily into the hands of God is to make an ongoing, nothing held back deposit. Don't leave any spare change lying around. Don't leave yourself an hour or two in the morning to decide, is he going to get all of you or not? He can guard it and guarantee it. I've read recently that the FDIC, the governmental program, will insure an individual's account up to $250,000. I've never tested that guarantee. Still, anything over that amount, to me it's interesting, is uninsured. And the government cannot, in fact, will not guarantee it. Beloved, your infinite God has no limit to what he can guarantee. There's no limit. Millions upon millions of Christians can deposit themselves into his care, and he will make every one of them good. He will hold every believer securely in his hand. Nothing approaches you unless it sifts through that sovereign hand. He will never go bankrupt of compassion and grace and power, and he'll never say to you, look, you've come enough, you've given me enough, I'm full up, no more. So make the deposit of your life into the safekeeping of your Savior, moment by moment, and day by day. And by the way, who better to whom you can entrust your life? Like, notice his complete sentence. Therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator. Don't miss the fact that Peter doesn't commend us for being faithful. Do you notice? He simply reminds us that God is faithful. Peter doesn't say, look, this guarantee of his providence in the life of the believer, that's only good for you if you're faithful. It's only going to work for you if you never slip up, never let him down. Oh no, beloved, this is going to work. His guarantee is eternally faithful, and it's because he never slips up, and he will never let you down. I'm not giving Christians the right to be unfaithful to God. Don't misread me, but do not misread this text either. He's emphasizing his faithfulness to us. Just ask Joseph. He's in prison because of the unfaithfulness and evil brought on his life by his brothers. Do you think that somehow meant that Joseph's life had somehow slipped beyond the grasp of God? Do you think that Joseph got out of prison because he was so faithful to God? That God finally said, okay, enough? No, he got out of prison because he'd had enough training in the administration of that jail that now it was time to administrate the nation. God started him on a house, put him in jail, and now it's time for the nation. Ask David if his sin meant that he was beyond the mercy of God as he repented to him. Would he ever write another song? He wrote some of his most precious songs late in life. Ask Job on the ash heap if his accusations against God and his demand that God show up and answer for the way he's mistreating his servant. See, you study that book, he doesn't abandon God, he doesn't curse God, but he demands an audience with God in despair and anger, often. Is God somehow then going to let him be on his own? Ask Job's wife, who suggested that he abandoned God effectively and allow God to put him to death. Is now God going to abandon her? Ask Peter if his denials of Christ meant that Jesus would deny him any future ministry fruit. Oh, wait just a second. We've been studying for years his letter. And it's still bearing fruit in your life and mine. Would you notice how Peter identifies God not only as faithful, but as creator? You know, this is the only place in the entire New Testament where God the Father is referred to as capital C, creator. Now you go through the New Testament and repeated in the apostles' preaching, text after text, the very core of the gospel and biblical theology repeatedly refers to God's created universe, reaffirming God's six-day creation. It's in the message of Paul to the Athenians. It is in the gospel account. In fact, Paul even names Jesus Christ as the agent, the one speaking the word, the worlds into existence, Colossians 1:15. But here in this text, God the Father is referred to as the faithful creator. And what a perfect place to put this. This is no coincidence. As if to remind the church and the believer, if God is powerful enough to create and control the universe, he is powerful enough to create you and control the events that come into the orbit of your life. So, the prophet Isaiah encourages the believer as well. Imagine the comfort of his words as he writes, "Lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these stars, the one who leads forth their host by number. He calls them all by name. Because of the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, not one of them is missing." Isaiah 40, verse 26, as if to say the creator of trillions upon multiplied trillions of stars never loses track of any of them. In fact, he's ordered where they are and he's named them and he's never lost any of them. Not one of them is missing. Not one of you is missing either. Jesus Christ told his audience in his Sermon on the Mountainside to look at the birds. Look at his creation. Look at the detail. Watch them through the seasons. Look at the fields around them. They're flowering and a beautiful array of color. And then consider the fact that this detailed, creative, brilliant, complex creation has a creator that values you above all of it. Matthew chapter 6. Peter wants us to consider God as creator, especially when you are suffering, discouraged. I read recently, since its opening in 1874, the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, England, has been the place where many amazing discoveries of our world, physics, mathematics, so much has taken place there. In fact, in that laboratory, scientists discovered the first electron, or first discovered the electron, and then the neutron. This lab laid the foundation for the discovery of quantum mechanics in the 1920s. This was the laboratory that laid the groundwork which led to the determination of the double helix structure of DNA in the 1950s. Well, what I found fascinating as I read about this is that at the entrance, over the entrance of that old Cavendish lab, above the great oak door, were carved the words from Psalm 111, which read, "Great are the works of the Lord. They are studied by all who delight in them." Isn't that great? Now, the words were carved in Latin because back then everybody knew it. They were carved there on the order of the first science professor at this Cavendish laboratory. 100 years later, nearly to the day, when the new lab opened in 1973, one of the believing professors requested that they inscribe the same text over the entrance again, only this time in English, because few people know Latin. And to everybody's surprise and to the believing faculty's joy, they agreed. And that's exactly what happened. Great are the works of the Lord, the creative handiwork of the Lord, and they are studied, observed delved into, researched, watched by those who delight in them. And then the psalm goes on to say, when you delight in them, you end up delighting in him. See, Peter is writing to suffering believers in a very practical sense. He reminds them that God is the creator of all there is, as if to suggest they take their eyes off their own suffering and look around at the evidences of a creator and ultimately trust him all over again. So if I can just make this very practical, one of the best things you could do when you're suffering or discouraged is study the creative handiwork of God. Go visit the zoo. Watch the animals. It won't be long before you realize your life is much better off, right? Take a walk around a lake, around the neighborhood. Plant some flowers. Study their design. Put a bird feeder somewhere. You can get to a window and study the detail and the creative design. Nothing thrown away, all magnificent. If you're able, get outdoors as much as you can. In fact, come over to my house and pull weeds. It'll make us both feel better. I find it incredibly telling, if I can go back to him for a moment, that after Job suffers months, I think probably nearly 20 months or more, perhaps as much as 2 years based on the time his counselors would have taken to get to him. After years of incredible pain and anguish and anger and doubt and despair and wishing he'd never been born, and why is God doing this to him? When God finally shows up, he does not deliver one answer, not a shred of explanation. Instead, he takes Job on a tour of his creation. I love that. He explains to Job that he is the creator of everything from ice to snow and hail and lightning. He describes how he measured out the universe, which we'll never see the end of, until one day perhaps. How he created the earth and wrapped it in a garment of clouds. He describes for Job the constellations of Orion and Pleiades. And then he takes Job on a tour of the animal kingdom as God reveals his sovereign care and design over the ostrich and the deer and the lion and the stallion, even the leviathan and the dinosaur, the behemoth, along with the donkey and the eagle. No answers are given to Job for his suffering, only a trip to the zoo. And when that tour is over and that demonstration of God's sovereignty and creation is shown to him, Job says to God, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours is ever going to be hindered. In other words, you have a purpose in everything you do, even for me, and nothing can hinder any of it. And Job redeposited his surrendered heart into the hands of his faithful Creator. Peter began this section by writing, the end of all things is near, that is, Jesus Christ is on his way. So how do you prep for life? How are you going to go through life as you wait his coming for you, especially when it's rough and wild and stormy? Peter would say, don't look within. Look around. And look up. I close with this more recent example of deepening trust and perspective. In an article I read recently, the author is Catherine Marshall. She was the wife of Peter Marshall, the chaplain of the Senate. Maybe you've read, as I have, his biography, used remarkably in the early 1900s as a pastor to presidents and Congress. Died young, unexpectedly leaving her with a little boy their little boy. And she wrote of her experience traveling to Cleveland by airplane. It was a friend of hers, actually, who told her about it, and she then made the application. As her friend settled into her seat, as she noticed a strange phenomenon, she told Catherine later. On one side of the airplane, she could see a sunset that bathed the entire sky with glorious, brilliant color. And then she looked out the window next to her seat, and all she could see was dark sky and billowing clouds, and not one sight, not one ray of color from that sunset. And as she heard that and then wrote in her own journal, she said, "It struck me that that plane ride was like my life, just like my life. No matter which window I looked out and I got to choose, my plane was still going to Cleveland." Beloved, the world and human history are going to reach its destination on time. You and I can't speed it up or slow it down. The church is going to reach her fulfillment and her destination on time. Your life and mine are going to reach, as children of God and as the bride of Christ, our destination on time. In the meantime, stay focused, keep praying, keep rejoicing, which means look out at that sunset as often as you can. Keep investing in the lives of people, keep serving the body, endure suffering as you wear the name of Christ. And Peter ends by saying, and by the way, every day, make a trip by faith to the bank of God's grace and goodness and power, and deposit again your life into the hands of your faithful Creator, and then keep doing what is right. Keep on doing what is right. As you wait for your plane to land, it's not going to land in Cleveland.